Hey everyone, Steve from Backcountry Gallery here, and this time around I have a first look review at the new Nikon 600PF f6.3 S-line lens. And let me tell you, this one seems aimed squarely at the birding and wildlife crowd and is an obvious replacement for my well-loved 500PF. This one was not on the roadmap, so it was a pleasant surprise when Nikon asked me if I wanted to take a pre-production 600PF for a test drive. In this video, we'll answer all of your birding questions. How much is it? How sharp is it? How fast is the AF? Is it weather sealed? How's the VR? How much does it weigh? How big is it? What's the control layout? Is f6.3 a deal breaker? And of course the big ones, should you get this lens instead of the 180-600, the 500PF, or 800PF? For this quick field test, we drove down to Florida to meet up with the Nikon rep. I only had access to the lens for an afternoon and the next morning, so time was tight to say the least. Also, everything you're about to see and hear in this video was based on a pre-production lens, so there might be slight differences when the finalized version is out. This also means that I'm somewhat limited in what I can do with direct comparisons to other lenses. Finally, and as always, I was not paid or compensated in any way for this review, and all of the travel expenses were mine. I want to remain neutral, so I continue to pay my own way for any and all reviews you see from me. Let's jump in. Price and shipping. The lens will retail for $47.99 and is set to start shipping later this month, October 2023. I want to start with cost because on paper, the lens seems a little bit spendy considering you can get the 180-600 and still end up at 600mm and f6.3 for about $3,100 less. So what about this lens makes it worth $3,100 more? Let's find out, and at the end of the video, we'll look at some comparisons with other likely contenders. Size and weight. Right off the bat, what hits you with this lens is the size and weight. This lens is only 11 inches long, making it considerably shorter than the 17-inch long 600TC and a bit shorter than the 12.5-inch 180-600. The 500PF is shorter at 9.3 inches, but add the FTZ adapter and it's about 10.5 inches, just edging out the 600PF. The 800PF is notably larger at 15.2 inches long. The diameter of the 600PF is just 4.2 inches and it uses a 95mm lens cap. Overall, it's incredibly compact, making it easy to slip into most camera bags. In addition to size, it's also light, coming in at 3.39 pounds or 1470 grams with the tripod collar. This makes it an impressive 30% lighter than the 180-600, which comes in at 4.71 pounds. Surprisingly, this lens weighs just a hair less than the 500PF with the FTZ adapter attached, with that combo coming in at 3.49 pounds or 1585 grams. The weight differences become larger as we look to the 800PF at 5.25 pounds or 2385 grams, and the 600TC at 7.2 pounds or 3260 grams. I found the weight advantage of the 600PF makes hand-holding the lens for long periods of time far easier and actually more enjoyable than something like the 600TC, and even noticeably easier than the 180-600 if it's a prolonged shoot. In my opinion, the size and weight will make this an ideal hiking companion. Weather sealing. The lens is fully weather sealed and even features Nikon's fluorine coating to help repel water droplets and dust. During our rainy afternoon, I did my best to test the limits of the weather sealing and the lens handled it like a champ, allowing me to capture this tricolored heron in a downpour without any worry at all. I'd have zero concern taking this into a wet, a snowy, or dusty environment, and I'm sure my copy will see all of those conditions on a regular basis. Buttons and switches. This lens features an abundance of controls, including lens function buttons, both LN1 and LN2, a focus ring, a control ring, a memory set button, as well as the focus select switch and range limiter. If you're weighing this lens against the 180-600, the control differences are significant. The 180-600's Spartan collection of controls only includes a control ring, a lens function ring, and of course the focus select switch and range limiter. The buttons on the 600PF have a nice tactile feel to them when pressed, and the slide switches both snap smartly into position. Like other Nikon Z series telephotos, VR and focus distance recall are controlled in camera. As I've mentioned in the past, I prefer that over a jumble of sliding switches covering the lens barrel since I can operate those controls with my eye to the viewfinder. The side of the lens has the focus select slider for manual or autofocus and a range limiter, pretty much standard issue on Nikon's long glass. The range limiter allows you to use either the entire focus range of the lens or limit the focus range to between infinity and 10 meters. This can cut acquisition time down if the camera misses a lock and then starts to hunt, since it can only take that hunting trip through a limited area of the focus range. This is a favorite feature for me when shooting birds in flight. Unfortunately, the range limiter does not include a short range limit option to help with closer targets. The lens features an FN1 button, a ring of FN2 buttons, as well as a memory set button, all of which have an extensive list of functions you can program them to perform. Also, note that the 4 function buttons around the front all act as the FN2 button, not 4 individual programmable buttons. One thing I really like is the memory set button on the side that, by default, allows you to lock in a set focus distance and recall it with another button, a task I like to program to the lens function 2 buttons. I'm happy to see this feature since I often use it when photographing close, tricky subjects. I simply lock in the focus distance for those subjects, and if the camera's AF wanders off target and tries for the background, I press my assigned recall focus position button to instantly get focus back in the ballpark. For more info on how I use this in the field, make sure you check out my Z8 and Z9 setup guide. Focus and control rings. Nothing too revolutionary here. The focusing ring is large enough to easily find with your eye to the viewfinder, and it spins with just the right amount of tension. I found it easy to keep a finger on it for manual override, so it passes all my tests. The control ring is nicely textured and easy for a wandering finger to locate when your eye is at the viewfinder. I program mine for ISO and makes for incredibly quick adjustments when shooting in manual mode. The dampening on the control ring feels great and hits that sweet spot between easy to turn when you want to, but not so loose that you spin it accidentally. The glass. The lens has 21 elements in 14 groups and features an impressive array of acronyms that are sure to impress the guys down at the camera club and, help deliver the best image quality too. It includes both ED, extra low dispersion, and SR, short wavelength refractive glass, as well as a PF element with a nanocrystal coating. Oh, and as mentioned earlier, the front element has a fluorine coating to help repel dust and water. You can look up the specifics for what these are and what they do on Nikon's website, but long story short, they are cutting-edge optical technologies that help deliver crisp images free from defects. In fact, there wasn't so much as a hint of chromatic aberration in any of my photos. Lens hood. The 600 PF includes a lens hood that's fast and easy to attach and detach. It's very similar to the one that comes with the 800 PF. The hood twists into place and engages with a little locking mechanism, effectively preventing it from detaching. To release, press the locking button and twist. I found it worked well and was more user-friendly than the button releases that we found on some older f-mount lenses like the 500 PF for instance. Minimum focus distance and reproduction ratio. The lens's minimum focus distance is 13.13 feet or 4 meters, resulting in a 0.15 reproduction ratio, roughly the same as the 600 TC. On the other hand, the 180 to 600 has an edge here. Its minimum focus distances vary between 4.27 feet at 180 millimeter and 7.88 feet at 600 millimeter, and it's capable of a 0.25x reproduction ratio. Basically, if you deal with close range subjects, the zoom will fill the frame better at the minimum focus distance than the 600 PF will. As an additional comparison, the 500 PF has a minimum focus distance of 9.8 feet or 3 meters and a reproduction ratio of 0.18x, just edging out the 600 PF. Collar and foot. Let's start with the lens collar. The collar rotation is satisfyingly smooth, smoother than the collar on the 180 to 600 if you're wondering, and the lock itself is textured nicely and has a really good feel to it. It also includes a little Kensington lock attachment point under the little cover. The foot itself is pretty much standard issue, although I wish Nikon, and Canon and Sony for that matter, would consider making these Arca Swiss compatible. Maybe if I say it enough, it'll happen. The foot does make a nice handle while carrying it, although it's a little bit short for my hand. I'm confident I will be replacing the foot with a third-party foot when I get my production model. In fact, the mount for the foot itself is the same as the one found on those 70 to 200 and 100 to 400, so I have a suspicion that many of the current third-party feet that work with those lenses will work with this one right out of the box. I'll test that out when I get a production model and I'll let you know. Gimbal balance. One frustrating aspect of some lightweight lenses is that they are difficult or even impossible to properly balance on a gimbal head with a large camera body attached. So I popped the Z9 and the 600pf on my Wimberley WH200 and braced myself for some disappointment. Instead, I'm delighted to say there was no problem at all. I had to use most of the plate distance to do it, but I was able to get it to balance perfectly, as you can see here. AF speed. This lens uses Nikon's STM motors, and they seem to drive the focusing elements with a great deal of enthusiasm. I was allowed to test AF speed, so I did a quick minimum focus distance to infinity test. Now, this isn't the same setup that I normally use, but Florida trees at infinity are probably as good as the trees that I have back home at infinity. For this lens, I had a time of 0.45 seconds from minimum focus distance to infinity. That's nearly twice as fast as the 0.8 seconds it takes for the 180 to 600 to run from minimum focus distance to infinity, and it edges out the 0.57 seconds for the 500pf. In fact, it's on the heels of the 600TC, which comes in at a blistering 0.4 seconds. The advantage with a faster focusing lens isn't so much in tracking the subject as it moves through the frame when you're already locked on. Just about any lens of any speed can do that. The real advantage is for the initial lock-on when you might need to drive through quite a bit of the focus range, or when you or the camera misses and the AF system starts to hunt. Faster focusing lenses like the 600pf certainly give us an edge in those situations. VR performance. This lens features Nikon's vibration reduction system that, when combined with the Z8 or Z9, gives you up to 6 stops of VR stabilization. With other Nikon Z series cameras, it's like 5.5 stops. Realistically, I was able to drop to about 1/125th of a second and get an adequate number of sharp images per burst just hand-holding without any support. The number of keepers, of course, increased each time I went like a third of a stop faster with shutter speed, and around like 1/320th or so, and faster my hit rate was just really, really good. Now, I could drop as low as 1/50th of a second and get the occasional razor sharp eyeball, but the failure rate was higher than I liked. However, with just a bit of support, like the edge of a window for instance, 1/50th of a second wasn't a problem. Of course, VR is highly subjective, since part of it depends on your ability to remain steady, and part of it depends on your definition of sharp. I mean, often when people show me an image they claim is razor sharp, I find myself wondering when they last sharpened their razor, you know? And I think that this is a major contributor to all the variance in anecdotal VR claims we see. Overall, I'd say VR performance was on par with other Nikon Z series telephotos I've used, which is to say class leading. I honestly think Nikon has some of the best stabilization on the market. Sharpness. Before we talk sharpness, I wanted to quickly mention that if you want to get the most from your Z8 or Z9, make sure you grab my setup guide. It's geared towards wildlife photographers, but readers tell me the advice works well for quite a few different genres. The book covers how I set each of my menus for wildlife work, why I set them the way I do, and how I leverage those settings in the field. It's a must-have for Z8 and Z9 wildlife shooters. Next, let's talk sharpness, and this is where the lens really shines. Again, normally, I would want to compare this against other known performers with my home focus test chart setup, and that will come later, so make sure you hit that subscribe button if you want to see that video. However, I do have some pretty persuasive real-world shots from this lens I'd like to share with you. In looking over the images I captured, this lens seems to deliver sharpness in spades. Nikon claims this lens is optimized for near perfect sharpness across the frame, and in the photos I captured, that actually seemed to be the case. Take a look at this 100% zoom of this little blue heron. I honestly don't know how much sharper you could want it. And note the head isn't directly in the center of the frame either. This looks great to me. Also, take a look at this Inhinga. This vertical shot put the head right towards the edge of the frame, and it still looks incredibly sharp. This is another place where the prime really edges out that 180 to 600. Although the 180 to 600 is really good in the center, we've done tests that show that it kind of slips as you go towards the edges. To me, this is a big plus in the 600pf column. Of course, the 500pf does well towards the edges too, so we'll have to compare all of them in a future video. Overall, when examining the images captured with this lens, I kept thinking that it seemed like I was constantly seeing the same level of sharpness I get with my 600TC, only at f6.3 instead of f4, which, granted is a significant 1 1/3 stops difference. I'll know more when I do my sharpness test video once I have my production copy of this lens, but based on what I saw, I think when it comes to sharpness, this lens acts like a baby 600 TC from a sharpness standpoint. Looking at my images, I'm comfortable saying it's close enough not to care. Teleconverters. This lens will accept both Z Series 1.4 and 2x teleconverters. I had a chance to try it with my 1.4 TC, and I found that although there seemed to be a slight unexpected drop in acuity, it was still very impressive. In fact, here's a 100% crop of a juvenile night heron. It looks really good to me. Not only did the lens seem to maintain excellent sharpness with a TC attached, it also seemed that AF remained very accurate, at least with our more or less static juvenile night heron here. It does, however, drop the f-stop to a relatively painful f9, so you might want to keep a tripod handy. Rendering and background. Overall, I thought the rendering looked natural with nice transitions between the sharp and autofocus areas with the 600pf. With the right subject and background distance, I found I could easily pull off some of those nice creamy, dreamy looking backgrounds. Sure, when the background was closer and or the light was harsh, the backgrounds look a little bit more disturbed. However, I want to stress that I think they would have looked very similar with the 600TC if it were set to f6.3, and that's something I'm going to test when I get the production copy. Still, keep in mind that sometimes PF lenses do what we'll call interesting things to backgrounds. So I want to shoot with this lens a little bit more before I render any kind of final verdict on this. Thinking strictly about creating nice backgrounds, the trick with a 600mm at f6.3 is that you really want to watch how well your subject fills the frame and how far your background is. If you do a good job filling the frame and maneuvering for a distant background, the results are often fantastic. However, you'll find that a 600 f6.3 is more challenging when your subject is really close to the background or if you're cropping heavily because the target was just too far away. For example, although I like this shot, the bird was a bit far away and I had to crop to just a little bit past the DX image area. That farther distance meant increased depth of field, so the water in the background looks a little too sharp and distracting to me. I could soften it, but I wanted to give you kind of an unmolested example. Is f6.3 a deal breaker? Cost considerations compared to other lenses aside, we'll get to those soon. Is f6.3 at 600mm a deal breaker from an optical standpoint? First, full disclosure, in my opinion, I think this probably should have been f5.6 instead of f6.3. I know there are some who would want this at f4, but realistically, that's not going to happen with this type of lens. And if it did, I imagine it would rival the 600TC in price. So I think it comes down to, should this have been an f5.6 lens? Well, it's only a third of a stop. I think f5.6 would have been a better choice. At least it sounds a lot better to most of us. For many photographers, f6.3 feels like it crosses some sort of a go/no-go threshold, at least to me. Probably an artifact left from the DSLR days when f5.6 was a bit of a boundary for many AF systems, which of course does not apply to mirrorless. However, the reality is that everything is a series of trade-offs. In this case, f5.6 would result in a larger, heavier, even more expensive lens, probably knocking it out of consideration for many shooters and maybe missing the design intention of a small, lightweight optic. From a practical field standpoint, that 1/3 of a stop difference probably isn't going to make it or break it for most situations. There's also the glass half full approach too. After all, for things like bird and flight photography, we're often stopping down a little bit anyway for the added wiggle room afforded by increased depth of field. The truth is that the 1/3 of a stop difference between f5.6 and f6.3 isn't that big of a deal when it comes to ISO or shutter speed. The difference is so minor, and I think the same applies to background rendering as well. In fact, let's jump over to Lightroom here for just a minute so I can kind of show you the differences in the way backgrounds look at different f-stops as far as depth of field and the amount of blur that we're seeing. Now, one of the things I do want to emphasize is I was not allowed to do this with the 600pf. So what I did is I came home, I went in my backyard, and I used the 600TC, and I even got the 500pf involved here. So keep in mind, this is not the actual lens we're reviewing. We're kind of taking a side channel here, but just to look at the difference in how backgrounds work, because I know a lot of people are wondering, well, what's the difference between like f4 and 6.3, and what's the difference look like between 5.6 and 6.3, things like that. So let's do that right now. And again, I'm going to put that 500pf. So again, want to stress, this is not the actual lens we're reviewing. We're just doing this kind of for reference. I found the easiest way to look at these is just to jump back and forth between them. So this is the 600TC at f4. Here it is at 6.3. And you can see there is a noticeable difference. And again, I expect the 600pf is going to look a lot like what we see here with the 600TC. So here's f4 to f6.3, and you can see why we pay the big bucks for the f4. Now, what about between 5.6 and 6.3? So I'm going to go over here, and here we have the 500TC at 5.6, and here it is at 6.3. Again, stressing that the 600pf's background might look slightly different with the way that it renders, but it's going to be very close. But the amount of blur should be the same. And you can see not nearly as big a difference as people are worrying about. Is it better at 5.6? Yeah, a little bit, but we go to 6.3 and you can see that it's not like night and day. And I'm not sure this is something you would even notice unless you were doing side-by-side comparisons. Now, the other thing I think is going to come up is why not just take a 500pf and crop it to the same proportions that we have with the 600 6.3 and not have to buy a new lens and maybe have the same or better depth of field because it's 5.6. Unfortunately, as we use a shorter focal length, we gain depth of field. So here is a 500 PF from that same exact distance. I was using a tripod, so I just mounted it on there, and you can see what the background looks like here. Now, I did crop it in to make this a little bit easier to compare. So here's the 500 5.6, and here is the 600TC at f6.3. We'll go back and forth, and you can see there is a difference. The 600 at 6.3 actually has a better looking background. It has more autofocus in the background than the 500 PF does at 5.6. And again, I believe this is going to look very, very similar when we compare it with the actual lens, the 600 PF, instead of using the 600TC here as sort of a surrogate. But you can see, I don't think that cropping the 500 PF, even though it's 5.6, is going to give you a better background than what you're going to get with the 6.3, because like I say, right here's the 6.3 and here's the 5.6. So hopefully this helps a little. Again, I intend to do a test with the actual lens in question once I get a production copy, so we'll take another look at this. So although I think the gear junkie in me would have been more emotionally satisfied with an f5.6 lens, especially at this price point, I'm not sure it's a deal breaker. In my opinion, it's more of a problem on paper than a practical field issue. Handling. Next, let's talk handling, since this is where PF lenses really shine, and I think when you're poring over the spec sheets, this is one of the biggest things that people tend to miss. The truth is, I can't overstate how much handling affects what you can do with a lens in the field, and in my opinion, that's one of the biggest strengths of a PF lens, and this 600 PF lens in particular. I found it was very easy to handle and nicely balanced on the Z8 and Z9. Although, full disclosure, I have to say that this lens with a Z8 is a really good way to go if you want to go as light as possible while still using a pro-level camera. Still, most of my shooting was with a Z9, and it proved really easy to handle for long periods of time. In fact, just the day before, I was shooting flight shots with the 180 to 600, and after about an hour and a half, even that lens was starting to feel a little heavy. The 600 PF feels like you can handhold it all day long. It's definitely my new hiking buddy. The combination of size and weight also allows you to use the lens in tough spots that are somewhat troublesome with a 600TC and a tripod. I was able to maneuver into tricky positions and quickly get into position far faster with this lens than when using like a traditional lens of the same focal length, i.e. the 600TC. Plus, the VR allowed me to skip the tripod, and that often saved valuable seconds when I needed to capture a fleeting moment. Like the 500 PF, this lens allows you to react much faster in the field and get into much better positions. Fast, easy positioning in the field is often the difference between just a nice shot and an absolute stunner, and the PF lenses do a great job of delivering. Is this a good 500 PF replacement? Obviously, the point of this lens is to replace the incredibly popular 500 PF, but does it live up to that expectation? And after using it, I think it does. It's about the same length and slightly lighter if you include the FTZ, all while adding 100mm to the focal length. It also focuses faster and includes a considerable number of Z-series buttons and controls you can program to your heart's content. Controls that are absent on the 500 PF. Of course, I realize it's not a big deal to use adapted lenses on Z-series cameras, but the truth is, there's nothing like native glass, and this offers more customization on a Z camera than the 500 PF does. Although the 500pf is less expensive and a third of a stop faster, in my opinion, the 600pf is a proper replacement and my recommendation if you're comparing the two optics. I can 100% promise that the 600pf is replacing my 500pf. It basically does everything the 500pf does and more with a native Z series mount. Why get this instead of the 180-600? I think when you see this lens on paper and look at the specs, this is the first question that comes to mind. After all, both lenses deliver 600mm at f6.3, right? However, that's where the similarities end. In favor of the 180-600, we have focal length versatility in a more affordable lens that delivers images with really good sharpness. Plus, it has an edge and reproduction ratio at minimum focus distance. The 600pf doesn't have that same focal length versatility, obviously, and it's far more expensive. But it's also over 30% lighter, faster focusing, easier to handle, has a better collar, easier to pack, and is sharper across the frame. It features better lens coatings and optics, plus has far more controls on the lens for customization. That's not to say there's anything wrong with the 180-600. For the price, it's hitting way above its weight, and I think it's a great choice for many, or even most, casual wildlife and bird shooters. It'll net you consistently good images with satisfying sharpness and the versatility of a zoom. In fact, although I'll eventually own both of these lenses, there are times I'll grab the zoom simply because sometimes you need a zoom to nail the shot. I think the 600pf is a more specialized lens for a specific type of shooter. Someone who values the lighter weight and size and wants a higher performance, more customizable optic that seems on par with the 600TC when it comes to sharpness. Again, based on my time with this lens, it seems like a baby 600TC, just, minus the TC. In short, you have two good choices, and you have to decide if the extra $3,000 for size, weight, speed, controls, and sharpness is worth it to you. Are those things going to contribute to either a higher keep rate or a higher level of satisfaction with your photos? Now, only you can answer that. For me, the advantages are well worth it since I value the extras it brings to the table, and I'm a sucker for a small, bitingly sharp lens. What about the 800pf? With only a $1,700 difference between the 800pf and the 600pf, you might be wondering which way to go. And it's tricky, and I think dependent on a few things. First, which focal length do you tend to use the most? Look through your current portfolio and think about the focal lengths you've used and how much cropping you had to do to get to the final version of that image. After all, you may use a 500mm or 600mm focal length all the time, but if it always requires you to crop, then you really should maybe just use 800mm instead if you can. For me, I shoot just as many shots at 800mm as I do at 600mm. So if I had to choose just one, I couldn't base it on focal lengths alone. And you know what? I'd bet my memory cards most people watching this video fall into that same category. So the next thing to consider is the size and disposition of your typical targets. If I'm shooting easygoing large mammals, 600mm is often more than enough. But if I'm after a smaller animal or bird that thinks I look a little bit hungry that day, 800mm often comes up short. I also think it pays to consider how important size and weight are. Although the 800pf is incredibly light, considering its focal length, it's still 5¼ pounds versus 3.4 pounds or so for the 600pf. The 800pf is also considerably larger, so that plays into things as well. Oh, and if you're thinking of just sticking the 1.4TC on the 600pf, that's of course a viable option as well. However, keep in mind that it's f9 versus f6.3 at that point. So for infrequent use, it works fine, but it's not something I'd want to do like all the time. So no clear-cut answer here, but hopefully that gives you a place to start. Final thoughts. Is it worth it? Hopefully this review answers at least some of your 600pf questions, and again, more to come. So make sure you subscribe and sign up for the free email newsletter at my site so you can get all those updates. As for my closing thoughts, I think Nikon aimed this lens squarely at bird and wildlife shooters who want the performance of a 600TC, but can't justify the lens, either due to its expense or its sheer physical size. As I mentioned a few times, in practice, this seems like a baby 600TC without the TC. It seems like it's neck and neck for sharpness, it focuses fast enough so as to be indistinguishable in speed, has tons of customizable controls, and many of the same top-of-the-line optical properties. The biggest difference, of course, is the 600pf is f6.3, not f4, and f4 is what you really pay for with that 600TC. In the end, I think Nikon did a great job with this lens. Although it's not for everyone, I think it'll prove popular. Once you start using it, let me tell you, it really grows on you, and I can see it becoming a favorite optic, like the 500PF was for me. Between its size, weight, and overall performance, it's an uncompromising travel and hiking companion, and I can see myself using it quite a bit, especially for those times when I want or need to maneuver into a tricky position, or I just don't want to lug around the 600TC on a tripod all day. I can also see it being a really great safari lens as well. Size and weight are often critical considerations on safaris, and this lens helps in both areas, although the versatility of the 180-600 may edge it out in a safari situation for some shooters. Finally, if you're a Nikon bird or wildlife shooter, this lens really rounds things out, doesn't it? We now have 3 levels of lenses. The higher end primes with the 400-2.8 and 600TC, the middle range that includes the 800PF, 600PF, and 400 f4.5, as well as the more budget-friendly 180-600. In my opinion, Nikon has by far the best lens lineup for wildlife shooters. Also, if you want to get the most from the AF system in your Z camera, make sure you check out my book, Secrets to the Nikon Autofocus System Mirrorless Edition. It covers the Z8, Z9, Z50, and the Z5, 6, and 7 series. The AF systems in these cameras are complex, and to get the most out of it, you really need to understand how it all works, and this book will explain it in fun, easy to understand, non-technical language. Check it out. It's the fastest path to consistently tack sharp photos. As always, thank you so much for watching. Have a great day.